We arrived in Ninh Binh during a typhoon, with no electricity, most restaurants and shops closed, and no idea if the trip would even be worth it. But 3 days later, it became one of my favorite places in Vietnam, and in this video, I will show you why. Welcome to Multi-Cult Trip. My name is Anna, and here I share all about my trips and cultural adventures as a neurodivergent and multicultural traveler. Ninh Binh is a province in the northern region of Vietnam, located about 100 kilometers from Hanoi. The main places that travelers come to visit in this area are the town of Tam Coc and the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Trang. It's common to visit the region as a day trip from Hanoi, and while that can be a good option for anyone with very limited time in Vietnam, you could easily spend 3 to 5 days or even a week there without getting bored. We were supposed to go on a cruise in Ha Long Bay before our trip to Ninh Binh, but it was rainy season and our cruise got cancelled the morning of departure because of a typhoon. After panicking for a few minutes, we then decided to postpone the Ha Long Bay cruise for a few days when the weather looked much better and bring forward our trip to Ninh Binh. We then booked a private driver to take us from Hanoi to Ninh Binh on the same day. The journey took just over 2 hours and the rain on the way was intense, but by the time we made it to Ninh Binh, it had pretty much stopped. When we arrived at our hotel in Tam Coc, we ran into our second issue of the day. The power was down. Another typhoon had hit the area the day before, causing quite a bit of damage and leaving the town without electricity. The main hotels, including ours, had their own generators, but most restaurants and shops were closed, so there was not much for us to do. Later that day, we learned that some areas in Hanoi had also been flooded, so going to Ninh Binh on that day was definitely the right decision. Our second day in Ninh Binh started with good news. The power was back and we could finally start to explore the area. The first place we visited was the Bai Dinh Pagoda. As soon as we arrived, we noticed that it was more like a spiritual city with lots of temples and courtyards spread out between the greenery. One of the first areas that we explored was the Arhat corridor that is lined with hundreds of stone statues that represent the enlightened disciples of Buddha, each one with a different face and expression. At first, I didn't know there were so many, but then I realized that if I were to stop and look closely at every single one of them, I'd spend hours just there. Then we climbed the Stupa Tower, which I think was the highlight of the visit. The tower has 13 floors, and from the top you can see the whole complex laid out below, with pagoda roofs peeking through the trees, mountains framing the landscape, and rivers weaving through them. The view was one of the most surprising things, but also the fact that most of the time we couldn't see any other tourists around us. Coming from the vibrant chaos of Hanoi, the quiet here felt almost unreal and grounding in a way that I didn't expect, especially as someone who struggles with crowds. There's definitely something serene about the landscape that connects really well with the spiritual purpose of the area. We were in Vietnam during low season between September and October, which is probably why it felt so peaceful. According to the official website, the ideal time to visit the pagoda is actually at the beginning of the year, so I imagine the place must be quite different then. One practical thing to know is that the complex is massive, but there are electric cars connecting the different areas. Looking back, the only thing I would do differently is going with a local guide instead of just exploring on our own. This felt like the kind of place where understanding the cultural and spiritual context would add so much more depth and meaning to the experience. Boat tours are one of the most popular things to do in Ninh Binh, and for very good reason. The winding rivers, dramatic cliffs, and huge caves make the perfect combination for a scenic and unforgettable adventure. There are 2 boat ride options in the area, one in Tam Coc and one in Trang. The one in Tam Coc is shorter and more convenient if you're visiting on a day trip. It's also the famous one where they row with their feet. We chose the other one in Trang because it felt a bit more immersive and less rushed, and we really wanted to take our time and make the most of the experience. Full disclosure, I didn't do any of the rowing myself. It was all handled by my partner, his mum, and the lady in charge of our boat. But hey, I was in charge of capturing the footage that you're seeing now, so Don't judge me. The route we followed lasted around 3 hours, taking us through huge limestone cliffs, dense forest, and caves, with 2 stops at some local temples. Tickets cost 350 Vietnamese dong, which is around 7 British pounds. Even though this place attracts thousands of visitors every year, the landscape feels so untouched and peaceful that it's easy to forget that there's anyone else out there at all. Our adventure continued the next morning. One of the best ways to explore Ninh Binh at your own pace is by renting a bike and cycling around, and that's what we decided to do. We checked out a few bike rental shops in Tam Coc and eventually found one with really good e-bikes at a great price and cheaper than some of the older bikes we'd seen elsewhere. I have to be honest though, at first I didn't love the idea of cycling there. As soon as we picked up the bikes, I had a little menty-b because I'm genuinely terrified of traffic and cars and vehicles in general. If you've seen my previous video about Hanoi, you have an idea of how overwhelming the traffic there can be, with barely any space between cars, pedestrians, bikes. And I was expecting something similar, so the idea of being on a bike with a lot of traffic really stressed me out. But eventually, with a lot of encouragement from my partner Jonathan and his mom Lisa, I managed to push through the fear and we set off, cycling through the most beautiful landscape of rice fields and mountains I have ever seen. Our first stop was the Bich Pagoda, that translates to the Green Pearl Cave Temple. This sacred sanctuary was built on a mountain, and it's a complex with 3 temples on different levels. One at the base of the mountain, the second one about 120 steps above, and the third one closer to the top. To reach the pagoda at the top, we first climbed 20 steps and arrived at the dark cave. As you can tell by the name, it's completely dark in there. I had to use my phone as a torch to climb the steps and find my way through the cave. There is an ethereal atmosphere inside, with Buddha statues, paintings, and religious decoration highlighting the significance of this place in Vietnam's Buddhist heritage. Coming out on the other side of the cave, we still had another 40 steps to get to the final pagoda at the top. One thing I noticed was that all the best attractions in this area have this perfect combination of history, culture, and spirituality with nature as their backdrop. It gives a sense of balance and serenity, even to someone who isn't religious at all like myself. The entry tickets to the pagoda were 250,000 Vietnamese dong, around 7 British pounds. Our next stop was the Buffalo Caves, and this was probably the most mixed experience I had in Ninh Binh.
Which way do we go?
We didn't know exactly what to expect, but it kept coming up in our research as a recommended stop, so we decided to go and check it out. The area itself is beautiful, surrounded by rice fields and mountains, and it's set up as a kind of rural farming experience. Visitors can go to a cave and a waterfall, try planting rice, join a cooking class, or just sit down for a drink at the restaurant. We went there specifically to see the cave, and that's where things started to go a bit downhill for me. The wooden path leading to the cave was flooded, and as I was carefully stepping through, I noticed something in the water that immediately triggered my biggest phobia: snails.
Oh my god, no.
No?
No.
Why? What's wrong?
Massive snails.
What?
Massive snails.
Is that?
Yeah.
Where? Massive what?
Snails.
Where?
To my absolute horror, there were dozens of them, underwater, attached to the wood, attached to the walls of the cave, and that was it for me. I panicked and had to run back out. Jokes aside, the path didn't feel very safe at all. Some of the submerged wooden boards were very unstable and they cracked just after a couple of steps, which felt genuinely risky.
It's cool.
Okay. This is not very stable at all. It goes down the moment you step on it.
I like the idea behind the place of learning from a local family about rural life, but for a popular attraction, it didn't feel very well prepared. So I can see why some people consider this a bit of a tourist trap. I'm also generally skeptical of attractions that involve a lot of interaction with animals. Even when they're presented as traditional or cultural, they're not always ethical. In a place like Ninh Binh, with so many incredible things to do, this is a stop that you can easily skip without feeling like you're missing out. The tickets cost 75,000 Vietnamese dong. Our last stop of the day was at the Lying Dragon Mountain, one of the most iconic viewpoints in Ninh Binh. We climbed about 500 stone steps to the top, where the famous dragon sculpture stretches along the mountain ridge. The climb doesn't take too long, but in the heat, it definitely makes you work for that view. My legs felt like jelly, and I had to take more breaks than I'm willing to admit, but the view from the top was worth every single step. And once we got to the top, we were greeted by the cutest host, a wild mountain goat. I was so glad we didn't miss this place. Seeing the whole area from above was easily one of the top 5 highlights of our entire trip in Vietnam. It wasn't as quiet as some of the other attractions, and while it would have been better with fewer people going up and down the steps at the same time, it was still great. There were 2 different paths, one leading to the dragon sculpture and another one on the opposite side with a smaller peak and a tower at the top. We didn't have time to do both climbs. By the time we came back down, it was already getting dark. The tickets cost us 100,000 dong per person. If I were to do it again, I would go in the morning, avoid the crowds, and do both climbs. I know this might sound silly, but despite all the fear and anxiety that I had in the morning, this ended up being one of my favorite days of the entire trip and one of the biggest surprises in Vietnam. Even though we were in Ninh Binh for just 3 days, one of which was wasted because of the power outage, I'm pretty confident that we made the most of it. If you've already been to Ninh Binh, please let me know in the comments your favorite activity around the area. And if you enjoyed seeing Ninh Binh from my perspective, please subscribe to help the channel grow and stay tuned for my next video. See you soon!